By the 12th century, nearly a third of England's territory was designated Royal Forest. Hunting a deer in those woods could get you blinded. Cutting a branch could cost you a hand, and simply being found living among the trees without authorization made you a criminal under Norman forest law. Tens of thousands of people lived there anyway. Outlaws, charcoal burners, poachers and fugitives built a shelter specifically designed for a world where getting caught meant losing your hands or your life. It needed no tools that could be confiscated. It used no materials that could not be found within 50 paces. It went up in 30 minutes, came down in 5, and after a season of rain and leaf fall, the site looked like untouched forest floor. No foundation, no post holes, no nails, no archaeological signature whatsoever. Modern archaeologists need ground-penetrating radar to find where these shelters once stood. Medieval forest wardens, searching on horseback, had no chance. The shelter was called a bender tent, and once you understand how it worked, you will never look at a modern campsite the same way again. The name tells you almost everything. A bender is exactly what it sounds like. You take flexible branches, hazel, willow, or ash, and you bend them. That is the entire structural principle. No joinery, no lashing, no frame assembly. The natural elasticity of green wood does all the engineering. Here is what a medieval outlaw or charcoal burner actually did. He walked into a hazel coppice, and hazel coppices were everywhere in medieval England because hazel was managed and harvested on rotation for fencing, wattle walls and fuel. He cut roughly a dozen rods, each about 10 feet, 3 meters long and around 2 inches, 5 centimeters thick at the base. That is all the material he needed for the frame. He pushed the thick ends into the ground in 2 parallel rows, 5 rods on each side, spaced about 2 feet, 60 centimeters apart. Then he bent each rod across to the opposite side and pushed the thin end into the ground on the far row. The result was 5 arches side by side, forming a tunnel shape roughly 8 to 10 feet, 2.5 to 3 meters wide, and 4 feet, 1.2 meters tall at the center. 2 more rods closed off the back end. The front stayed open as a doorway. That was the frame. No rope, no pegs, no cordage of any kind. The ground held the ends, and the natural spring tension of the hazel held the arch. Traditional Romani builders in Wales used a tool called a kettle prop, essentially a pointed stick, to punch the holes in the ground before inserting the rods. That was the only tool besides a cutting blade. The covering is what turned this frame from a skeleton into a shelter that could block driving English rain for weeks. Medieval forest dwellers used whatever they had. Animal hides were the oldest option. A single deerskin stretched across the top of a bender created a waterproof roof with no treatment required. Wool cloth was more common by the 13th century, and wool has a property that most people today do not appreciate. Lanolin. Raw wool contains natural lanolin, a waxy substance that repels water. A tightly woven wool blanket draped over a bender frame sheds rain almost as effectively as a modern waterproof fabric. Not water-resistant, waterproof. The fibers swell when wet, closing the gaps in the weave, and the lanolin coating causes water to bead and run off rather than soak through. For longer-term camps, the covering could be treated with linseed oil or beeswax to increase waterproofing further. The process was simple. Rub the oil or wax into the cloth, let it cure in the sun, and the fabric becomes genuinely impervious to water. This is the same principle behind modern waxed canvas jackets, which cost $200 or more. Medieval forest dwellers figured it out with a handful of beeswax and a wool blanket. The covering was laid over the frame in overlapping sections so that each upper layer shed water onto the layer below it, exactly like roof shingles. No stitching required. Gravity and overlap did the work. The open front faced away from the prevailing wind, and in heavy rain, a spare cloth could be draped across the opening. Inside, the occupant gathered bracken, heather, or dry leaves and piled them 6 to 8 inches, 15 to 20 centimeters, deep as ground insulation. This layer kept body heat from draining into the cold earth, the same principle that modern sleeping pads are designed around. A wool cloak served as both blanket and outer garment. The entire sleep system weighed nothing, cost nothing, and used no material that could not be found in the forest within an hour. But the Bender tent was not just a survival shelter, it was a disappearing act. This is the detail that made Benders uniquely suited to people living outside the law. Every component was biodegradable. The hazel rods, once the covering was removed, would spring back upright and eventually blend into the surrounding undergrowth. The holes in the ground filled with leaf litter within days. The bracken bedding decomposed in weeks. The fire pit, if one was used at all, could be scattered and covered with forest debris. Within a single season, the site was indistinguishable from untouched woodland. This is not speculation. In 2021, Patrick Wiley, an archaeologist at University College London, began one of the first doctoral theses ever written on Romani archaeology. Part of his research focused on Bender tent sites in Epping Forest, where as many as 300 Romanicals had lived for well over a century until their forced eviction in 1897. Wiley needed ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and magnetic susceptibility testing, technologies that detect changes in soil composition invisible to the naked eye, just to locate where the camps had been. The hard-packed earthen floors showed up on radar. Buried hearth remains registered on magnetometry scans. But on the surface, walking through the forest, there was nothing to see. If 21st century technology struggles to find these sites, imagine what a 12th century forest warden faced. He was riding through dense woodland, looking for people who built shelters from the same material as the trees around them, covered them with earth-coloured wool, and broke camp every few days. The Bender tent was not just a shelter, it was camouflage, and this is where the history becomes darker. Medieval forest law was not a bureaucratic inconvenience. Under the Norman kings, the royal forests operated under a separate legal system enforced by appointed foresters. Before the Charter of the Forest in 1217, punishments for forest crimes were brutal. Disturbing a deer could result in blinding. Killing one to feed your family could mean execution. Even cutting wood, the very material a Bender tent required, was a punishable offence. The Charter of the Forest, signed 2 years after the Magna Carta, reformed the worst of these punishments. The death penalty for poaching was abolished. Mutilation was outlawed. But heavy fines and imprisonment remained standard, and the forests continued to be patrolled. For the thousands of people who had been declared outlaw, meaning they were stripped of all legal protection and could be killed on sight by anyone, the forest was both refuge and prison. Charcoal burners occupied a strange middle ground. Their profession required them to live deep in the woods for weeks at a time, tending slow-burning charcoal pits that could not be left unattended. Historical records from the New Forest describe charcoal burners erecting shelters from larch poles and covered frameworks, structures nearly identical to Bender tents. They were tolerated because the economy needed charcoal, but they were also socially outcast. During the Middle Ages, charcoal burners were frequently accused of evil practices and considered dishonourable. This made them perfect allies for fugitives. A charcoal burner's camp deep in the woods was one of the few places an outlaw could hide with a legitimate cover story. Historical sources confirm that charcoal burner communities served as a largely segregated population that could provide refuge for outsiders and fugitives. The Bender tent was the architecture of this underground network, cheap, fast, invisible, and shared between the legally marginal and the legally dead. The most famous charcoal burner in English history was a man named Purkis, who in the year 1100 found the body of King William II in the New Forest after the king was killed by an arrow during a hunt. Purkis loaded the body into his cart and transported it to Winchester. A charcoal burner living in a temporary shelter in the woods was the first person to find a dead king. That tells you how deep into the forest these people lived. So if a shelter this effective could be built in half an hour with free materials, why has it vanished from public knowledge? Part of the answer is social prejudice. The Bender tent survived longest among Romani communities, who continued building them well into the 20th century. At Thorny Hill in the New Forest, nearly 400 Romani people lived in Bender tents and tin shacks through the 1930s. They were subject to forest bylaws that prohibited fixed floors in dwellings, a rule specifically designed to keep their homes temporary and removable. One water tap served the entire community. By 1942, the population had declined to 161. By the 1960s, prefabricated houses began replacing the Benders. The people who knew how to build Bender tents were the people whose knowledge was never recorded in manuals, never taught in schools, and never valued by the society around them. When those communities were broken up, the knowledge scattered with them, but it did not disappear completely. And here is how you build one yourself. You need a dozen hazel or willow rods, each about 10 feet, 3 meters long, and roughly 2 inches, 5 centimeters, thick at the base. Green wood, freshly cut, bends without cracking. Seasoned wood snaps. That distinction matters. Lay out your footprint. Mark 2 parallel rows about 8 feet, 2.5 meters, apart, with 5 insertion points on each side spaced roughly 2 feet, 60 centimeters, apart. Use a pointed stick or the handle of your knife to punch holes about 6 to 12 inches, 15 to 30 centimeters, deep at each mark. Push the thick end of the first rod into the ground on one side. Walk to the opposite mark, bend the rod over in a smooth arc, and push the thin end into the ground. Repeat for all 5 pairs. You now have 5 arches. Add 2 rods to close the back end by pushing them into the ground at the corners and bending them to meet at the center. For the covering, use a wool blanket, a canvas tarp, or, for maximum waterproofing, waxed canvas. Lay the covering over the frame starting at the back and working forward, with each section overlapping the one below it by at least 6 inches, 15 centimeters. Secure the edges with rocks or logs at the base. No stakes needed. Gather bracken, dry leaves or pine needles and pile them at least 6 inches, 15 centimeters, deep across the entire interior floor. This is your insulation. Without it, the cold ground will drain your body heat regardless of how good your covering is. Orient the open end away from the prevailing wind. If rain is coming from the opening side, hang a cloth across the doorway. Your first attempt will take about an hour. By your 3rd or 4th build, you will be under 30 minutes. A skilled builder can have this shelter standing and weatherproof before a modern backpacker finishes unpacking their tent. The Bender tent is not a museum piece. It is a functioning shelter design that outlasted the Roman Empire, survived Norman forest law, sheltered communities for centuries, and requires nothing that the forest does not freely provide. The medieval outlaw who built one did not have a survival manual. He had knowledge passed from person to person, generation to generation, among the people who lived closest to the land. That knowledge was never written down because it belonged to people who were never asked to write anything down. Charcoal burners, Romani families, forest fugitives, the people the chronicles ignored. Now you have it. If you learned something valuable here, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us share this forgotten knowledge with builders, campers, and anyone who believes a shelter should not cost $300 and end up in a landfill. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever built a bender tent, or are you going to try one this season? Subscribe and let's keep digging up what they buried.